Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the astrological forecast for February of 2022. Joining me today are astrologers Austin Coppock and special guest co-host Patrick Watson. Welcome, guys.
Hey.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm gonna do a little bit of an overview of the forecast for February, and just to give you a quick snapshot for those watching the beginning of the video, and then we'll get into a deep dive of the astrology of the next 4 weeks right after that. So first, here's our planetary alignments calendar, which shows the astrology overview of February. Right at the top of the month, we have a new moon in the sign of Aquarius on the 1st of February. Then 2 days later, Mercury stations direct, ending its 3-week retrograde period through the signs of Aquarius and Capricorn. Then about a week or so later, Mercury, moving forward again, ingresses into the sign of Aquarius on the 14th. Then we have a Leo full moon on the 16th. The same day, Venus conjoins Mars in Capricorn. The next day on the 17th, Jupiter sextiles Uranus. Then the sun goes into Pisces on the 18th. And then there's a few other things that we'll talk about later in the episode, but that's the major stuff for this month. Here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where in the zodiac the planets will start at the beginning of the month and how far through the signs they'll get by the end of the month. All right. Welcome, Patrick. This is a fun trio because we actually go way back. All of us first met at Project Hindsight, I think at one of the first conclaves in like 2006 or something, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I met Chris in person in 2006. I didn't know that Austin was barren. Sorry if I gave that away. And then 2007, summer 2007, it was like the second phase conclave where we met in person, Austin, for the first time.
Really?
Yeah,
swear I
summer
met you
2007.
at the first one. I thought I met you before Kate.
Huh? Maybe so. I guess I'll have to try to remember better.
The experiences blend together.
I suppose so. Yeah, 2006, 2007.
Well, regardless, this is Patrick's first time joining us for a forecast episode. We have done some pretty legendary. We did a collaboration a few years back when we did the Saturn and Capricorn episode, which actually turned out really well in retrospect and in terms of some of our predictions, if people want to go back and listen to some of that.
Yeah, let me just say that the dire tone, which we were trying to manage and yet absolutely snuck through anyway, ended up being on the nose.
Right.
Yeah, it aged well, as a good Saturn podcast should, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it was good in the lead up to the Saturn Pluto stuff. So speaking of, we've had a lot of Capricorn action going on over the past month. We're getting towards the tail end this week as we're recording this today on January 25th, 2022, starting a few minutes ago, probably at like 1:13 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. And this is the 337th episode of the show. We are getting ready to wind down and end the Venus retrograde. Mercury is also just over halfway through its cycle of retrograding and is about to go back into Capricorn. And then we just had the ingress of Mars into Capricorn, where it's heating up and will heat up in this month of February, a lot of the same areas of the zodiac and of different people's birth charts as Venus was just going through most of the past month. So why don't we start first by doing a little bit of review, since we're now towards the end of the Venus retrograde and we're in the post-Venus retrograde shadow period, of how that's been going. Have you guys seen some interesting stories in terms of Venus retrograde?
I have one. So that Venus retrograde conjunct Pluto was right on an angle for me, and I'm in a Capricorn perfection, and so I expected it to matter. And we spent most of the first 2 weeks completely snowed in on top of our rural hill. You know, we have about a half-mile driveway with a 700-foot incline, and we just got, so it was the day before Christmas, and we got like a nice snowfall, and that was beautiful. And then on Christmas, it was heavier, and it just kept coming and accumulating, and so it was totally impassable. It was a somewhat Venusian quarantine, entrapment, whatever, imprisonment, because it was just Kate and I having a nice Christmas. And then the day after, and then the day after, and then the day after, and we're like, okay, it'd be great to get food for the cats. And I have like one fun memory from that. I hiked down the ice and snowbound driveway a couple times up and down in order to get supplies that someone was able to drop off at the bottom of the road. So now I can, how should I say, taunt my children with what we had to do. I literally did the walking through the snow and up a hill.
And they'll be like, but Dad, didn't you have drones that would fly groceries like back and forth from the Amazon warehouse? And you're like, no, son, I had to walk to the end of the driveway. Yeah, I like that. All right. So I did want to show a graphic that I got from Stella Graphia from Reddit, who personalized this for me. This is a Venus retrograde graphic that shows where Venus stationed retrograde later in Capricorn at 26 degrees on December 19th, and then where it retrograded back to at on 29th of January when it stations direct and stations at 11 degrees of Capricorn. And then based on that, what other degrees of different signs that it's aspecting based on the major Ptolemaic aspects during that time. So I'm mentioning this because all of February, even though the Venus retrograde has just ended, Venus is going to be in its post-retrograde shadow phase throughout the entirety of February, all the way until March 1st. So it's still going to be retreading over a third time some of those same degrees. And as a result of that, some of the circumstances and events surrounding this may still be being wrapped up or brought to completion or reaching some sort of sense of finality over the course of February.
I remembered my story. So one thing that about Venus retrograde, 8 years ago, during the Venus retrograde of 2014, that was when my son was born. He was born during the Venus retrograde, so now he has just had his birthday. He's gone through his first Venus return, with Venus being retrograde in Capricorn, the same sign that it was in at the time of his birth. This is his first Venus return, so I was kind of curious to see what would happen because he has Venus retrograde natally. And basically, it was his first crush. That's the biggest thing that I kind of got out of just observing him in this time, is I sort of saw that he kind of developed a little bit of a crush. And so that's one thing I sort of recall from my personal life about Venus retrograde. So I anticipate that age 16 should be pretty interesting, the next one. But the other thing just sort of in the news that I thought was very Venus retrograde is this incessant focus on Machine Gun Kelly and Megan Fox. Apparently they just got engaged and he gave her a ring which would hurt her if she took it off, which I thought was, that's a bit Venus Pluto for my taste. So that the fact that, there's been this sort of focus on this sort of strange couple and, having this very public display of affection in this kind of almost unhealthy or extreme way, I think is very evocative of those themes of Venus and Pluto, with Venus being retrograde, conjunct Pluto.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that, as I've been kind of doing my thinking and feeling and observing yet another Venus retrograde. The way that, how should we say, that Venus retrograde has a way of folding pleasure into pain, and pain into pleasure. I did a little, I wouldn't call it a ritual, but I just kind of sat for a couple hours and wrote my thoughts out during the Kazemi. And that was one of the biggest themes, was the, like, taking all of your joys and all of your sorrows and recognizing that it's one thing, right? Like they're come from the same place. It's the same wavelength of experience, right? And that felt pretty profound. And so I think that, like, the combination, especially with the Venus retro in Capricorn, of like binding, right, with a ring, and then that's a promise, but it's also pain, et cetera, that feels like kind of the stupid Machine Gun Kelly version of a very real theme. No offense to Machine Gun Kelly fans out there.
Or a lot of offense. But I also just was reminded of the fact that Kim Kardashian also finalized her divorce from Kanye West, and there's been a lot of drama about that because apparently Kanye West decided to buy a house across the street from where Kim Kardashian lives, and like this is just obviously not a healthy way to process, a breakup.
Well, and he also like recently released a song where he talked about punching Pete Davidson, who is his ex-wife's now new love interest, which is another funny like Venus retrograde conjunct Pluto thing.
Right, and isn't Kanye West now dating Julia Fox? And I don't know, I've just seen a lot of interesting headlines about them. She's quite a character, it seems. So we're definitely seeing some interesting new unions being formed in this time with these people who I guess, unfortunately, for better or worse, probably worse, atavistic of this Venus-Pluto complex.
Yeah, well, and I'm quickly pulling up charts because I was just curious where the Venus retrograde, hearing that Machine Gun Kelly and Megan Fox got engaged, was making me wonder where that's hitting in their chart. And both of them actually do have Capricorn placements like pretty heavily, which is actually pretty striking. Because Megan Fox is an astrologer and mentions astrology like a lot over the course of the past decade in various interviews and even in a movie, and the astrology bit got cut from a movie, This Is 40, but I was just watching it the other day and it was actually kind of a funny clip. But if this time is correct, if this chart is correct, she actually has 27 Capricorn rising, and so Venus stationed like right around the degree of her ascendant, which is pretty striking. And then MGK has Virgo rising, I believe she was the one that put his birth time and his rising sign out in the past year or so, being an astrologer, and he has Saturn at 25 Capricorn in the 5th house. And so Saturn would have stationed on top of that. And that's, again, kind of impressive in terms of wanting to make a long commitment or a permanent commitment to somebody. So good times.
Was he 32? Did I see the 1990 birth?
That appears to be correct. So he's just coming out of his Saturn return. I mean,
I was thinking of that's Venus a multiple of the Venus cycle. This is the 4th synodic return year.
Well, at age 32, that's when the Sun, Venus, and Mars come back to their same relative positions in the chart. So he has Venus and Mars in the 7th, and here he is, age 32, having a very Venus and Mars in the 7th type of year. So, yeah, good call, Austin.
Yeah, well, that was a good example also, just in terms of the Venus-Pluto conjunction can be very intense and can be very, especially from an outside perspective, can be like, wow, those people are going like way over the top with this, but at least internally it can just be a very deep sense of commitment and passion and all the other things related to Venus just turned up to, 200%.
Well, Hades did kidnap Persephone, right? That's kind of...
Yeah, and on that less lighthearted note, like we talked about in the yearly with Lisa, the Ghislaine Maxwell trial occurred during this Venus retrograde, and then it looked like, I think she was guilty of 6 charges, and last I heard, there's an issue with some juror, and so it might be a mistrial, and so you might literally have to do a Venus do-over.
Was she on a retrial?
Yeah, there was something about one of the jurors that opens up the possibility that it'll get overturned and they have to retry her. The topic of abduction, right, is very Venus Pluto, that sort of unpleasant behavior. And so anyway, that was already a hit that we talked about last month. But the having to maybe do it over again is just like double Venus retrograde.
Totally. And also and also that she was convicted during that time, which is good follow-up. So I'm glad you mentioned that. But yeah, I mean, the Venus conjunct Pluto, one of the big themes that I noticed was bringing up past events, because symbolically Venus turned around and began retracing its steps through the zodiac as if there was unfinished business from an earlier time that must be revisited. And I just kept seeing people do that, like earlier time, revisit something theme over and over again. And in some instances, it seemed like part of the theme was, for certain people, when it was tied in with relationships especially, was looking back to remind yourself of not just what you left behind, but in some instances, why you left it behind, as a sort of refresher on why you made the right choice to leave something in the past. So obviously there were some people that decided to resume something or not to leave it in the past. But for others, it's not always going back to something, but sometimes it's just like a reminder of what you left behind.
Yeah. Okay. So I just found something kind of wild, or another good hit. I agree entirely with what you're saying, Chris. It's a nice way to say it. So as a result of the Ghislaine Maxwell related stuff, Prince Andrew was basically disowned by the family. And check out his chart. Does he have a Venus-Mars conjunction at the very end of Capricorn? And,
oh, really?
Right? Like, it's literally for Venus-Mars activity.
Right, yeah. I mean, Venus-Mars people tend to, I won't say for all people who have this aspect, but I will say everyone who seems to get involved in this sort of problem seems to have this aspect. It's worth noting too that Epstein himself was born with Venus conjunct Mars in Pisces. And when you look at other people who've been ensnared in issues of sexual or social transgressions, you see Venus conjunct Mars. The disgraced former governor of New York, Eliot Spitzer, had Venus conjunct Mars. Anthony Weiner, who was also done by his transgressions on Twitter, sending bad pictures to underage women. Like, he was born, I believe, with Venus conjunct Mars. So there seems to be this theme with people with Venus conjunct Mars and transgressing social boundaries or sexual boundaries. And so the fact that we're having this major Venus-Mars moment, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Venus-Mars individuals like Prince Andrew and others kind of rising to the surface in this time, either committing these acts or in some way facing consequences for them.
Here's Andrew's chart for the audio listeners. So Mars is at 27 Capricorn, Venus is at 28, and Saturn is at 14. And this is a day chart. And interestingly, that configuration is squaring his midheaven at 22 Aries. So there's some tension there with the career and public profile as a result.
Yeah, just one thing to support or to reinforce what Patrick was saying about Venus-Mars, type Venus-Mars connections in charts, and that being associated with these sort of scandals. Firmicus Maternus spends about 100 pages talking, just going off about Mars's effect on Venus, and it gets so hyperbolic that you're tempted to think that this guy's crazy, and it's certainly judgy. But he reaffirms over and over again Venus, Mars, and scandal. I believe he used the term monstrous lusts, and then gets very creative with what he imagines these people might be doing. But yeah, it's all over. It's all over Firmicus.
Yeah, and so part of the reason we're talking about this is going to be one of our ongoing themes this month, because Mars literally just yesterday on the 24th or 23rd, I believe, ingressed into Capricorn, and it's going to be pursuing Venus, which is slowing down and stationing direct here at the end of January and beginning of February. But because Venus is so slow coming out of its retrograde or its direct station, Mars is in this really unique position that does not happen often, where Mars actually catches up to and overtakes Venus in the middle of the month. What did you say?
Ominous, really.
Ominous, okay.
In some ways.
I mean, there's some stuff. So Mars overtakes Venus, and the principle of Mars in some way gets the better of or bests Venus in the middle of the month, especially around the 16th when that conjunction goes exact. And then what's interesting, though, is after that, in the second half of the month, Venus starts picking up speed, and she doesn't do it while still in the same sign of Capricorn, but as soon as the two change signs at the very beginning of March, Venus actually overtakes Mars. So there's this really interesting interconnection and dance between the two of them, where they're sort of going back and forth. One is on top earlier in the month, and then one is on top later on, and that'll be really interesting to see over the course of the next 4 weeks.
Someone just said in the comments that Eliot Spitzer is in the news again because he got caught with another sex worker trying to commit violence against her. So Jesus. Yeah, I mean, this is Mars, maltreating Venus, I suppose. One of the ways you could interpret it.
Yeah, well, that's certainly one of, I don't know. That happens with Mars-Venus. It doesn't happen with every person who has a Mars-Venus conjunction. Let me just flip it with some other examples. So of people who fight in cages, MMA people, some of them are fun to watch and charming and move beautifully. Some are merely effective. Of the ones that are fun, charming, like move gracefully, et cetera, a high number have Mars and Venus in the same sign. A perfect example of a fighter who's on top now and has been for a while is Israel Adesanya, who has Mars-Venus at the end of Leo, and who has been accused of no wrongdoing, and is super fun and charming and effective. And so this brings up a principle that it's probably worth us talking about, because we just got Mars-Venus literally all month. And so thinking about the different ways they interplay is probably helpful. So while, Mars, Mars contradicts Venus, some of Venus's desires, Venus's help can be very helpful for Mars. And with Israel, right, it's like, well, you already got to fight in a cage, but you can make it fun, right, and be charming and make money while doing it. And as I've looked at this for elections, I've tended to think, well, it's not so great for Venus, but this is actually, in some senses, this is bonifying Mars. So Mars is actually going to get it done. It's already in Capricorn, already exalted, but like with a little, grace and panache.
Yeah, I'm looking for some other prominent, through my files, I just did a search in Solar Fire for some prominent Venus-Mars conjunctions within 5 degrees, and I came up with people like Vincent van Gogh, who had it in Pisces in the 9th house, just off of the midheaven. Charlie Chaplin, Bruce Lee. There's another fighting example for you, Austin. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Amy Winehouse, and Donald Glover is another good real example. He has that one in Leo.
Well, and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, I believe, is in the news. I saw something this morning. People were talking about wanting him to run for president or whatever. It's just coincidental. I don't know much about it. I don't often hear of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but it came up this morning when I was looking at news.
Yeah, but so to break it down symbolically, though, I mean, one of the nice things about Venus-Mars conjunctions is just that interplay and sometimes a balance between like form and function, and between the overt principles of going out and getting something versus the other principle of standing back and waiting for something to come to you. And sometimes the delicate balance between those two impulses that we all have inside of us. And sometimes when you go too far in one direction or too far in the other direction, and the challenge of seeking a balance between those two, I think that's part of the interplay that we're going to see over the course of the next 4 weeks.
Someone just noted in the comments that Kanye West is also a Venus-Mars conjunction native. I forgot about that, in Taurus.
And there's such a, you can see with a number of these examples, there's one thing that none of these people, heroes, villains, and everybody in between lacks is passion, right? The Venus-Mars always brings passion. It can bring, intemperate and destructive passions, but it can bring other types as well.
Yeah, passion and an appreciation for the sensual and sensuality. But one of the things with these random chart examples that we've brought up did really demonstrate it, just to bring things full circle, is that this graph works really well. Like if you have planets in these degrees, especially near the stationary degrees, then this Venus retrograde was probably important for you, or is important for you for some reason that may not even be clear yet. But sometimes once you get out of these things, especially once we wrap up the post-shadow phase by the end of the month and it makes its 3rd exact hit to some of these degrees, then I think the Venus retrograde should be more clear. Especially with the Mars ingress recently moving in. I did horoscopes this month. I wasn't sure if I was going to do them, but it really helped me to crystallize some of these mundane transits by thinking about them in terms of, what whole sign house relative to the ascendant was Venus retrograde in, and then as soon as Mars ingressed, it just went into the same house. So it's just doubling up on and reasserting and calling for some divisive or decisive action when it comes to the same topics. And for some people, that may be challenging. For other people, it may actually be a very productive time of getting certain things done and making a choice between two different things. So I think it would be good for people to think of it in that context as well this month.
Someone else just said in the comments that they have Venus and Mars conjunct the Sun, and that they help employees stop sexual harassment at work and litigate sexual harassment lawsuits. So I think that speaks to another more positive interpretation of Mars and Venus, that it still intersects with this topic of social transgressions, but instead of committing them, it's about sort of policing them, and regulating them.
Right, but the life still has an intersection with that topic, even if the native is not performing the activity.
There you go.
Yeah, and speaking of boundary transgressions, I think that was a keyword that you used earlier, Patrick, that made me laugh a little bit because it made me think of what's happening in the news right now with Russia. And of course, all the astrologers are very interested in this because this Venus retrograde in Capricorn happens every 8 years in roughly the same spot of the zodiac. So if you take it back 8 years, around this time of the year, Venus was also retrograde. And that was, of course, when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine previously. So we're seeing an interesting repetition of that, or what seems to be, what everyone thinks is a build-up to a repetition of that with another potential invasion of some sort.
Right. I looked back at the previous Venus-Mars conjunctions that were close to the degrees of the upcoming ones in relation to Russia, and it's really interesting because there was a Venus retrograde conjunction in Capricorn in 1994, and that was when the Kremlin Accords were signed and were being negotiated, where basically basically the Ukraine agreed that they would hand over their nuclear arsenal to Russia, and it was kind of a time of de-escalation in some ways, which is interesting because everything right now seems to be amping up towards escalation. So one of my hopes is that maybe the conjunction from Venus will soothe this separative Mars to some extent. Of course, it could also represent a potential circling back around to sort of, going from these times of de-escalation right after the Cold War ended towards, kind of getting, making up for it or repairing what was sort of broken, which kind of ties back to something that Putin has said about the fall of the Soviet Union, right? He says it's this big tragedy and has to be sort of undone in some sense.
Yeah, that was what I kept coming back to, because I had 3 questions as I was researching this astrologically, which is 1, why is the sign Capricorn seem to be important for Russia with that Venus retrograde 8 years ago coinciding with the annexing of the Crimea? And then why is this current retrograde in Capricorn again coinciding with the buildup? Especially, it seems like if it does happen, it'll happen when not just Venus has just stationed direct in Capricorn, but also Mars has ingressed into Capricorn, and Mercury will also retrograde back into and station direct in Capricorn this month. So one of my questions is, why is Capricorn important for Russia? 2, why is this current Venus retrograde cycle important for Russia? And 3, what is the relevance of these of the Saturn-Neptune cycle, which is a separate thing that's going to complete in a few years for Russia? So a lot of astrologers famously think back to, there were some predictions that were made in the early 1980s by astrologers. For example, in a book on mundane astrology by Nick Campion and Charles Harvey and Michael Bagent, where they predicted the downfall of the Soviet Union under the triple conjunction of Uranus and Neptune and Saturn, yeah, at the end of the 80s, and Capricorn at around 1989. And of course, that is when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union started to disintegrate over the course of the next couple of years. So that was also in the sign of Capricorn. So it's interesting that there's something about that. And when I was researching this, reading Nick Campion's Book of World Horoscopes, he had a bunch of charts for Russia. And the early 20th century charts did not feature Capricorn prominently, really, at all. It wasn't major in terms of the revolution in 1917 or anything else. But when it did become important was with the breakup of the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s. And you just see a ton of repetition of Capricorn placements, not just with outer planets, but sometimes with inner planets and luminaries like the sun and the moon. So I think what's happening actually with these 2 Venus retrogrades that we've experienced with Venus going retrograde in Capricorn is it harkens back to that statement that Putin made in 2005, where he called the collapse of the Soviet Union a major geopolitical disaster of the century, or the major geopolitical disaster of the century. I'm not sure if the translation's right, but and it made me realize that what it is Venus is going back in this instance, because part of what he's doing is he's going back and trying to reclaim and reintegrate some territories that used to be part of the Soviet Union before they broke up. And that's the going back and reconciling something theme that's coming out here with the Venus retrograde in both instances in Capricorn. And that's why it relates back to Capricorn, because that's the signs that were so active and so emphasized at the breakup of the Soviet Union. So he's trying to put something back together that was broken apart previously.
Saturn-Neptune conjunction cycle goes further back. If you want to tell us about those Saturn-Neptune conjunctions.
Yeah, so I was talking to Nick Dagan Best, and he had done a lot of work on this. Both of you have looked into that as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can just kind of tell the whole story of the Soviet Union with Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. Like beginning Saturn, Stalin dies in the middle, and then end. There were 3. It's literally those are the 3 biggest events in the beginning: the death of the first, whatever big leader, and then the end. And then you can half it and quarter it, and it just the Soviet history just tracks perfectly with the Saturn-Neptune cycle.
Right. You basically, so to sort of take you through it, 1917, that was the Bolshevik Revolution. That was under a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. The next one was 1953. That was the year Stalin died. It also happened to be the year Putin was born. So Putin was born under the same Saturn-Neptune conjunction that Stalin died under. And then Soviet Union broke up in 1989. So naturally, everyone's looking ahead to 2026. And there's any number of possibilities, about what that could mean for Russia.
Yeah, let's just say that it's like the Uranus and Gemini for the United States. It looks very different every time, but it's very significant both at the time and sets a direction that lasts for decades to come. It's just like a key inflection point.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the course of the next month, because the Mars ingress is now going to speed up and bring some greater tension and quicken the pace of events in the same sign that it's integrated into, where Venus was already retrograding all of this stuff. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the course of the next few weeks. And let's leave it at that. I did want to pull up, I have another diagram that shows the Mercury retrograde as well, which, even though we're coming out of it, that's one of the things that's ending when Mercury stations direct on February 3rd. So it's stationing direct at 24 degrees of Capricorn, pretty closely conjunct Pluto. But that's also going to be emphasizing the Capricorn area of the chart. And then its post-retrograde shadow period is not going to end until February 24th, once it passes 10 degrees of Aquarius, because that was the degree that it stationed retrograde at. So some of that is still going to be operative all the way through the first 3 weeks of the month, in terms of at least not having it as intense as, when you're in the middle of the Mercury retrograde, but there's still some like cleanup stuff that's happening over the course of that few week period in a post retrograde shadow.
Yeah, there's something I wanted to say about that and a couple other things. Just the beginning of the month. The month begins, Venus just stationed direct, and then Mercury stations direct during the first week of February. But both are still, both have a fair way to go to climb out of from their descent. And so we're in that sort of, 1 week apart, staggered, like, okay, now it's direct, but they're both slow, and they need a little time to get moving.
Yeah, sort of the hangover phase almost is what I call it sometimes.
I wish Mercury retrogrades were partying and getting drunk.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on what kind of people you're hanging out with. But yeah, I guess Pluto is not the soberest of, Pluto is actually much more sober than if it was a Mercury retrograde, like conjunct Neptune or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. one thing, we don't have to go into too much detail about it, but one thing I've just sort of noticed about Mercury-Pluto conjunctions, especially when Mercury is like retrograde around Pluto, is that it seems to describe times of consequential announcements, or like the disclosure of private information or secret information, espionage. It also, at least in the political sphere, it's also coincided with times of like defections and bipartisan activities where you get sort of turncoats or people who, who turn on their own in some sense. And that has, some pretty obvious connections to like the nature of Mercury being more sort of ambiguous, being a sort of trickster figure or duplicitous figure at times as well.
That makes perfect sense. He's like Mercury's totally an agent, right?
Right. Yeah. So like, it's not a comprehensive list or anything, but there are just like a few times where like it took just a few people from one side like voting one particular way to have a kind of a big impact on things. So like, for example, all the way back in the 80s when Reagan nominated like Robert Bork to go on the Supreme Court, on that day, that was the day that I was born, Mercury was retrograde conjunct Pluto. And that was when 6 GOP members joined the Democrats in voting down Bork. So that was pretty huge, and even that term balking is still used as like a verb to sort of signify like this sort of betrayal or something, or, unfairly attacking someone or something like that. And then interestingly, in December of 1998, that was when Democrats joined with the GOP to impeach Clinton. Wasn't successful ultimately, but it took like a few turncoats. That was when Mercury was conjunct Pluto, and that's interesting as well because Clinton himself was born with Mercury conjunct Pluto. And then you see a few other things involving Clinton with Mercury-Pluto conjunctions. In January of 2005, he teamed up with W. Bush for Haiti earthquake relief. And actually, W. Bush was also born with a Mercury-Pluto conjunction. So you see these two presidents from two parties who are sort of coming together, transcending the sort of boundaries, crossing that sort of threshold.
Bush Sr. was also like the head of the CIA at one point, which is a nice little Mercury-Pluto thing.
Yeah, I don't know that H.W. Bush had the Mercury-Pluto conjunction, but W has the Mercury-Pluto conjunction.
Oh, right, in Leo. Yeah.
And there was another time in 2000, I actually think that was January 2010 that W. Bush teamed up with Clinton. It was actually in 2005 that Clinton teamed up with H.W. Bush for, I think, an Indian Ocean relief effort. But and that was also at a Mercury-Pluto conjunction. So there are a few other ones. Probably the most recent one was from 2016. In December, right after the election, there was this movement among some members from the Electoral College to get people to overturn or to alter their vote from what the electoral vote was at the time of the 2016 election, the so-called faithless electors. Electoral College tried to persuade the fellow electors to switch away from Trump, and what ended up happening at the Mercury-Pluto conjunction itself, when Mercury was retrograde in conjunct Pluto, they actually had a few Democratic electors defecting away from Hillary, even though she wasn't, contention to win it at that point anyway. So you see this. So I guess the theme of Mercury-Pluto conjunction, especially when Mercury is kind of acting irregularly, we seem to see just crossovers and defections and unusual alliances forming. And I would think that, to your point about Ghislaine Maxwell and that trial and everything, one of the sort of question marks right now is that just a few days ago, Ghislaine Maxwell said that she has stopped trying to keep the so-called 8 John Doe's names from being kept secret. And so
that would be
everyone's
wild.
Kind of waiting on bated breath to hear, what are those names going to be? And I think that announcement will probably come when Mercury finally stations direct. I imagine that would be when the judge sort of makes the official sort of order to make some of these names public. And that would potentially cause the supporters of those people, if they're somehow implicated as being, involved in some of these crimes, you might see their supporters turn on them. You might see some crossing of party lines and people condemning the figures who are brought up in that disclosure.
Yeah. Disclosures was a major theme that we talked about last fall when Mercury stationed square Pluto, I think. And what was that came out? It wasn't the Pandora Papers, but it was the other one?
It was the Pandora Papers.
Okay. Yeah.
The Panama Papers came out under a different Mercury retrograde. And so this is especially interesting with Ghislaine Maxwell because she was born with Gemini rising with Mercury in Capricorn. So, this Mercury retrograde going back into Capricorn is going to be there'll be some sort of pronouncement or announcement or leak or something that communicates something which was previously considered too volatile and too charged to be public. So
yeah, or something that was just hidden or buried for some reason. So in terms of dates, so we're talking about this because right in the first week on the 3rd, Mercury stations direct in Capricorn, pretty close to Pluto, but then it's the following week that the exact conjunction between Mercury and Pluto, the 3rd exact conjunction, because we've had 2 already, takes place on the 11th of February. And then this whole conjunction probably isn't over until Mercury departs from Capricorn and moves into Aquarius the following week on February 14th, where we have a very romantic looking Mercury ingress into Aquarius on Valentine's Day.
Well, some of us have Venus in Aquarius, Chris.
Okay. I mean, I'm not knocking it. That's, I'm trying to think how does a Mercury in Aquarius communicate like love and affection on Valentine's Day?
Binary.
Through what?
Binary code 001-110.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. Through like a robot.
A code.
I like that.
Through Morse code.
Through astrology.
Oh yeah, through astrology. Intellectually. That would make sense. All right, so that's good for the Mercury stuff. I'd like to touch base, unless there's any other review stuff, because we're going back and forth between some past and some future, since we're in the middle of cycles that are like carrying over from the past and that we've seen part of play out already and that will carry forward into the future. I know there was one thing you wanted to touch on, Austin, which is just like things that we meant to say in the year ahead forecast that we forgot to or didn't.
Yeah, because we had some sort of debriefing afterwards, and we were like, shit, we should have talked about blank. And I don't remember all of them. You brought up one, which was the how should we say, the continuing of the labor struggle themes, the unionization, which we talked about all last year, but somehow forgot to talk about during the actual yearly.
Yeah, because that was a major Saturn-Uranus theme that we kept seeing come up over and over again, and then did actually come up again even more at the end of December, very close to the third and final exact Saturn-Uranus square. But we've continued to see things having to do with labor and unions and some of the tensions between, employers and employees and different things like that be relevant. And I think we're going to continue to see that, especially over the course of this year, especially later this year when that square comes back into being operative again in the third quarter, because we know it's going to come back within about a degree around September and October. But even before then, because Uranus keeps getting supercharged this year due to the nodes and the eclipses and other things like that, we may see it popping up around those times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there was over the last month and a half, there were a number of events. I know one thing that I kept seeing was information coming out about how poorly a lot of the Amazon workers were. I never assumed that Bezos was doing right by everybody, but there were a lot of relatively shocking cases of, I don't even call it negligence or even cruelty.
Wasn't there a tornado that was threatening a warehouse?
Yeah.
And they told them to stay there, and then people died in the tornado ripping the warehouse apart?
Mm.
And they like to text their loved ones. They weren't sure they were going to make it. And I mean, I don't know how that didn't have a big impact. Someone brought up a really, tornadoes in the warehouse. That's pretty Saturn-Uranus. Someone brought something up in the chat that I thought was kind of interesting. They said, do you think the Saturn-Uranus square is relevant to the Great Resignation? And I think that certainly is relevant. I think I kind of got more of an impression of that from Saturn in Aquarius, since that happened so close to the beginning of the pandemic, when a lot of people for the first time were given the opportunity to pause on their work and decide whether or not they wanted to do it. And of course, Saturn is the planet of no. And I think it's really interesting that in the US, we have this phenomenon of the Great Resignation, but also in China at the same time, Chinese millennials, they're calling it the lie down movement, which is basically the same idea, same sort of thing. They're getting burnt out by these extraordinary schedules being placed on them, and they decided that they'd rather lie down, rather than work. So,
and they take hilarious pictures and put them on social media of just doing nothing, like in the middle of different locations.
Yeah, this is really kind of an interesting connecting bridge between, like, overworked US and Chinese millennials, is that they're both participating in this Saturnian, movement to just stop.
I've seen on Reddit, there's this one subreddit that's become huge over the course of the past year, in 2021, called Anti-Work.
Anti-Work.
It says, a subreddit for those who want to end work, are curious about ending work, want to get the most out of work, free life, want more information on anti-work ideas, and want personal help with their own job/work-related struggles. It has 1.7 million subscribers, I guess, on that subreddit alone. And it keeps hitting the front page, which is the only reason I know about it, because I keep seeing it on the front page of Reddit semi-regularly over the past 12 months.
It's hilarious, some of the pictures.
So what is it about the symbolism? What is the symbolism? Can we pick that apart a little bit of Saturn square Uranus, of like why this is showing up so clearly when it comes to labor and like work-related issues? Or what are the themes that we can take from that might be applicable to other spheres of people's lives?
So I have a couple reads on it. One, I think Patrick's right in that it is also just Saturn in Aquarius, right? And Saturn would like to not move. Thank you very much, right? Slow, heavy, the least happy to move of any of the planets, and just has associations with that. And then the Aquarius side of Saturn is, when we're looking at the Aquarius side, you often see the sort of boundaryness that you always get with Saturn, but by going to the out, like going away, like crossing the wall, so that whatever is on the other side. A lot of times with Capricorn, we get more of a I'm stuck inside the walls. Saturn Aquarius is more I'm going to be stuck outside, or I'm going to exile myself. And then with Uranus and Taurus, it's also a theme. Labor is a theme by in and of itself. And I think the Uranian shocks to Saturn are bringing about what are Saturnian significations really quickly. And, the changed chaotic circumstances have pushed trends that were already there. Almost all of this stuff was already there. All of the things that people are getting fed up with. It's just that it got, it got put on fast forward by Uranus.
I would also say that, like, yeah, Uranus is the great, destabilizer. Uranus is disruption. And so the consequences of people saying no, that Saturnian superpower, saying no, it comes with risks. It comes with, the loss of livelihood. And I think that Uranus square to Saturn shows that sort of dynamic of saying no at a cost, or taking some risk in doing so. And then the consequences of that are then that places are understaffed, and that there are sort of continuing supply chain issues and all of these things. So that's how I see how it's related to Saturn Uranus. I see Uranus as disrupting the status quo in this regard, and because of people's insistence that a new kind of agreement or new standards are observed, for people's dignity, for people's livelihoods, and so forth.
Yeah, and also with Saturn and Uranus, you're saying the status quo, and that's Saturn, and just what happens when you have an entrenched status quo and you have a power differential between two groups, and one group is really happy with the status quo and is profiting from it or is gaining from it for some reason and wants to keep things the same, versus you have another group that maybe is at a disadvantage over time with that situation and wants it to change. And sometimes when those two can't come into an agreement or are so far out of alignment, they reach a pivotal breaking point where the Uranian side especially wants to rebel and wants to like reject everything. And seeing some of these protests and like picket lines and stuff, there's like a local grocery store here in Colorado right now where they've gone on strike, and strikes have become like a major recurring theme over the past few months of people just like completely grinding the entire system to a halt and banding together in solidarity and forming alliances in order to force the sort of establishment to make a change that they're reluctant to, that they don't want to do, but eventually through those sort of alliances are able to force some sort of change by creating a completely untenable situation where the entire structure of everything could just fall apart and go away if there isn't some sort of change that's made. And so in distilling it down to that, I can also see how sometimes that's happening in people's personal lives, where the Saturn thing is something that's been that way for so long that it doesn't seem like it's something that can change or that you want to change or that you're willing to put the effort into to changing. But then something comes along that forces it because it creates such a disruption and a destabilization that you can't but give in to some level of change of some extent, sometimes minorly and sometimes really major disruptions and changes, but something has to change, and there's a situation that comes up that forces that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say the dark side of this dynamic as well is probably the way in which Uranus can push Saturn to sort of extremes or to go beyond the bounds of, or reasonable bounds of. And so I think it's interesting to see how like a lot of the anti-mask movements and protests have been seemingly sort of getting louder and being more amplified. And that is sort of taking that Saturnian principle of rejection to an absurd degree, even in the face of a pandemic, sort of rejecting sort of common sense methods to reduce the spread of transmissible virus, is sort of holding to that, despite cutting the nose off despite the face, basically.
So it's like the idealization of the rebellious principle, or the idealization of the, person that breaks away from the crowd and goes against the status quo, even in instances where maybe that's like not as impressive as it might seem to some people.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally Saturn and Uranus drive each other crazy. Right? If you have somebody who's very Uranian, right? So freedom is is high among their ideals and virtues. They want to be able to experiment. They don't want to be told how to do everything. And you stick them in a room with Saturn, who's like, no, there's a right way to do things. It's important that you follow the rules. That Uranian person is going to be driven crazy. And if you have a Saturnian person who's like, no, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. Let's do it slowly, carefully, and according to protocol. And they want that. And there's a Uranian person constantly challenging them and be like, yeah, but what if we do it this way? If you thought about it this way, it's going to drive the Saturnian person nuts. And so that's part of just the dynamic with Saturn Uranus. It's hard enough to get them to agree when they're in a trine, but when they're in a hard aspect, they just drive each other nuts.
Right. Totally.
You have to be, and so historically and also natally for those who have it, we sometimes get cast as the diplomat or the negotiator between two archetypally conflicted personages or energies.
Yeah. So speaking of that, I think that's a good segue to talk about our very first lunation, which activates that square, and that is super early in the month. So it's a little bit on the border, depending on your time zone. Here in Denver and Mountain Time, it's on the 31st of January, but on the East Coast time, it's already early on February 1st. But we have a new moon at 12 degrees of Aquarius. And what's interesting is that it's separating from the square with Uranus, both luminaries are, which is at 10 degrees of Taurus. And then immediately after the conjunction, both luminaries apply to the conjunction with Saturn at 15 degrees of Aquarius. So in some way, this lunation is very much activating that square, and it's kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place in terms of those two energies, but moving from the Uranian and heading towards the Saturnian.
One of the things I've sort of noticed with like new moons, full moons, or, these, conjunctional lights to Saturn or other planets is you often can see what the mood is by like the memes that are circulating around that time. So I'm reminded of last year when we had the Sun-Saturn conjunction at the inauguration. The big meme of that time was, that grim-faced Bernie Sanders, with his coat on, sitting in the cold, looking all serious. And people sort of took this very Saturnian image and made it into, comedic gold. And so I would assume that, with both luminaries, coming to conjoin Saturn in that frosty sign of Aquarius once more, that we might see some meme arise in that time around those days that focuses on the way people look when they're sad or old or something like that. Because there was a similar sort of meme when the moon was conjunct, like a huge pile up in Capricorn Saturn, where people were posting photos of themselves with this app that aged them by however many years they set. So everyone was posting these pictures of themselves as old people under this big like moon Saturn thing, which I thought was just, kind of hilarious. So I would wonder if there would be some kind of evolution on that theme with this new moon.
So did you just prophesy that a new meme shall arise?
Yeah, the meme prophet.
Yeah, I guess so. I that is my prediction, is that there will be a meme which fits the themes of that Sun, Moon, Saturn lineup.
That's the 21st century version of like the three wise men, like
yeah. I'm not saying it's like, the Jesus of memes, but yeah, I think that that there'll be some meme that goes around that encapsulates those themes of like saying no or shutting someone down or being cold or being sort of grouchy and
being over
saturnine.
Right, being done.
It'll be something like that. I wish I could be more precise. Maybe if you dug into like the Dwads and Decans and everything, you might be able to get some more detail on that. But that's I'm afraid that's like the most I could say about it.
Even memes aside, like last year, you mentioned that meme and that picture of Bernie Sanders came out of the inauguration, but that inauguration itself was like the most locked down inauguration ever, where there were just like fences and like military, and that place was much more sparse than it's ever been. There's usually like huge crowds and everything, but part of the reason it was coming off of the coup attempt on January 6th, when there was this riot at the Capitol building, and the Capitol was, whatever happened, pillaged or whatever. And so you were coming out of that Uranian event, and then we were left with like the Saturnian event of just like everything being on complete lockdown by the time of the inauguration 2 or 3 weeks later.
Yeah, great point.
So similar themes there, going from the Uranian and heading towards the Saturnian.
Perfect.
All right. So that new moon is happening there on the first day. My election is very early in the month, so I do want to mention that next. But do either of you have anything else you want to say about this lunation before we move on?
Yeah. So aside from the, it activates Saturn-Uranus, but very much on the Saturn side, and it's only a few days before the Sun's perfect conjunction, the cazimi with Saturn.
Yeah.
And I think that's really it's a moment that happens once a year, and it's really a moment of sitting with sort of what the challenge is, like what the situation is.
And that perfects on February 4th, just quickly.
Yeah. And there's, with Saturn, it's like, okay, so I guess it's this way for now. And then, of course, you then ask, okay, well, so what do I do about that? How do I handle that? Can that change? How does that change? But it's very much sitting with the structure of how things are now.
Yeah, there's a somberness or a soberness to it in the reflection on that. So both in terms of the new moon on the 1st, as well as especially that Sun-Saturn conjunction that's happening on February 4th.
Low sentiment, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and of course this is happening right as Mercury is stationing direct in Capricorn, Venus is now moving forward, and Mars is quickly closing the distance to Venus. So it's like we're coming out of this Mercury retrograde period of some things being thrown up in the air or having to go back and revisit and revise previous things, not just with Mercury in our communications, but also with Venus in our relationships and our social contracts. And the sun and the moon are just coming off of this disruptive square with Uranus. And so then you get this sober like assessment period of how are we going to move forward from here during this first week of February.
So talking about Saturn is drying out my eyes.
Yeah, I like your dynamic lighting there. We were saying before we started recording, you need like a cigarette and just like some smoke going off of it.
I tried turning on the ring light to balance it out, but it's no match for the sun.
Okay, that's all right.
Get a little noir score there.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I do want to make sure that I mention our electional chart for the month, because that takes place on February 2nd, 2022 at 8:15 a.m. with Pisces rising. So let me see if I can pull that up here on the screen.
Yeah, this is a nice one.
Yeah, you've seen this chart. You're paying attention to those Pisces rising charts this month, because Mars, now that it has gotten out of Sagittarius, it's freed up Jupiter, so it's no longer squaring Jupiter and overcoming it, but also it's freeing up the other mutable angles. So you can do mutable signs rising without making Mars super angular by sign in the chart. So here's our election, February 2nd, 8:15 a.m. We're going to put Jupiter right on the ascendant. So basically just take this chart, set it for February 2nd in your location, set it for about 8:15, but then adjust the ascendant until Jupiter is right there on the ascendant at about 7 degrees of Pisces. So what you end up with is like one of the best possible situations in terms of essential dignity and in terms of traditional astrology for the planet Jupiter, where Jupiter is on the ascendant. It's in its own sign. It's one of its traditional signs of Pisces. It's in a day chart. So Jupiter is fully benefic. It's of the sect in favor, has no afflictions, has a nice little sextile from Venus and Mars up there in Capricorn. The moon is also in early Pisces, and it's applying to a conjunction with Jupiter in the rising sign or in the first whole sign house, with Jupiter also ruling the 10th house of career and reputation in public life. So this is just an amazing Jupiter election for growth, expansion, optimism, even idealism, even potentially some creative things, since of course this also has a little bit of that Jupiter-Neptune co-presence goodness, which is giving a sort of idealistic bent, but also potentially a creative or illusory bent if you want to create something that looks sort of dazzling in some sense. It's the downside for the chart. It's not that great for friends and groups and alliances because it has Mars in the 11th house in a day chart. This is early in the month, so Mercury is still a little bit retrograde, but it's about a day and a half from stationing direct. So it's pretty close to stationary direct so that you can use it, but just be aware of that in terms of using this chart versus another one in terms of retrogrades. It's also still very close to the Sun-Saturn conjunction. If you can, try to mitigate that by putting the midheaven sextile to the Sun and Saturn within 3 degrees by backing up the time just a few minutes in your location. So that's it. What do you guys think? So you've seen charts, you're looking forward to charts like this now that Mars is out of Sagittarius, Austin?
Yeah, I mean, we've only got so much Jupiter in Pisces. You know, you should be looking at the moon's monthly conjunction to Jupiter for the next 4 months, like as a starting point, right? There were some things I'd hoped to get together for that election, but had to put off a little bit because everything's retrograde. One thing I was just going to add to Jupiter significations, especially when it's a strong Jupiter in the 1st or 10th, it's just success and winning, right? And those are very old significations, but those are things people like. You know, you're like, would you like to succeed at what you're starting at this particular date? Jupiter can help.
Yeah, that makes me think of the hermetic lot of Jupiter is the lot of Nike, Nike, which means victory.
Yeah.
The lot of victory is Jupiter's lot. Yeah, so Jupiter, if you like victory, you might want to use this
You like
election.
winning?
Yeah, if you like winning, this is a good electional chart. So we actually found 3 or 4 other electional charts in February, which are available in our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, which Lisa Scheim and I just released today, actually, to patrons through our page on patreon.com/astrology podcast. So if you go there and you go to the $20 tier, you will see how to get access to that recording. And if you need elections for later in the year, we also recently released our full 2022 Auspicious Elections year ahead report, where we picked out one auspicious electional chart for each of the next 12 months. So you can find that at chrisbrennanastrologer.com/2022 elections. All right. So those are our elections.
Sorry, it just occurred to me that if I had different personal tastes, I could have totally branded something with auspicious.
Awesome. Ooh, Austin, auspicious. Yeah.
If I wanted my brand to be Groaners.
I mean, we still have, we're still looking for, we could do a mug. We could do the Austin Auspicious Astrology Podcast mug. Lots of people are sending in funny pictures on like Instagram and stuff, receiving their Sure mugs from me over the course of the past month through our new merch store at the astrologypodcast.com/merch. So maybe that's your angle for the Austin mug. Maybe we finally found it.
Austin the Auspicious. That's
terrible. Man, my mom's side of the family just calls me Aus. So that's why that popped into my head.
Oh man, you're going to start some memes here that you don't want to see the end of.
Yeah, probably.
So.
I should probably shut the fuck up.
Right. All right. So let's see. We are halfway through, so I should probably mention our sponsor this month as well. And our sponsor this month is this awesome little company that I found called Ephemeris.co, where they make little pendant necklaces with your birth chart, your actual birth chart imprinted on them. So if you go to Ephemeris.co, you can enter in your birth data and enter in your birth information. And I worked with them because originally they did, I think, quadrant houses, but I said, I use whole sign houses, so I couldn't really endorse this unless you had that. And they actually were very flexible and integrated whole sign houses for me, so I could get an awesome little pendant necklace with my birth chart in it. So they say you can deeply connect with your birth chart and use it as a sort of daily ritual. It's gender neutral and looks good on any outfit. So if you go to their website, you see the different options for it. You can also get an engraving on the back of it, which is a cool little feature, especially if you're getting it as a gift. And they also have some different birth chart reports that you can order through their website. So if you want to get a 10% discount on the pendant, just enter the promo code, all one word, Astrology Podcast, ideally all in capital letters, but I don't think it matters, at ephemeris.co. And if you go to ephemeris.co/necklace, it'll take you right to this specific product, which is their actual pendant. So I thought that was pretty cool. I've been talking to them about some other customization options, like maybe if it just showed, for example, their default one shows all of your modern planets, including Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. But if like you wanted to do one that just showed the 7 traditional visible planets, that would be kind of cool. Or even one where it just shows like your sun, moon, and rising might be interesting for some people as well. So they said those are some options we could talk about, which is pretty interesting. And I think people should check it out.
That's cool. It would be fun if they could do square ones too. If somebody wanted to like rock their medieval chart.
Oh yeah, like a medieval, like a square chart, or like the triangle chart, or even like a Rashi chart from like Indian astrology.
Yeah, just like a I don't know, like a 3x3 inch thick steel plate. No, but
right.
Anyway, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, the only people that would not like that you don't want to get this a present for is people that don't want to share their birth chart. So the Scorpio risings in your family may not be super thrilled about that gift, but for those that do otherwise like showing it off, it's a great astrologer gift.
Yeah, that's really funny.
Yeah. All right. So I think that's good for this midway part through the show. So we've gotten a full week, maybe a few days, maybe first half of the way into the month. So why don't we pull up week 2 and see where we're at? And maybe get a little bit further into the month. So I've been showing the illustrations that Zartana did for me this month, as she's been doing for the past several months for the different weeks. We've talked about the Sun-Saturn conjunction. The same day, there's also a Mars-Jupiter sextile, where Mars transiting through Capricorn sextiles Jupiter in Pisces. I kind of like that. That's a little productive. It's like not super standout aspect, but it seems useful. It seems good and productive to go along with that Sun-Saturn conjunction. What do you guys think?
Yeah, and that reminds me of something that I made a note to talk about, and then I left that notebook somewhere that I can't find it. So, one, I agree that it's useful because that Sun-Saturn can be a pretty demotivating sort of it is what it is. But Mars-Jupiter is very much, and you can do stuff about it. Like that Mars and Cap energy is very willing to endure the suffering of work to change situations. And Jupiter adds both the hopeful as well as the winning quality. But one of the things I wanted to say is I was thinking about this. Could you leave it at the Pisces moon, if you would? I was kind of marveling at how few signs the visible planets are in. And then that got me thinking about midpoints and scissor yogas. And so, if we're looking at the chart with that Sun-Saturn in the middle, that Sun-Saturn in Aquarius, but we've got multiple planets in Pisces and we have multiple planets in Capricorn. The midpoints between the Pisces and Capricorn planets are all falling into Aquarius, making that Sun-Saturn really the center of things. And the scissor yogas which can be fortunate or unfortunate, are very similar to the principle of midpoints, is that if you have at least one planet in each sign flanking a given sign, the combination of their influence affects the house in the middle. And so it's just thinking about how, if we take that flanking principle and that midpoint principle, almost all of the planet's energy kind of, makes a sandwich out of that Sun-Saturn.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that actually ties into the concept of spear bearing in ancient astrology, especially with the sun, where if you have planets that are rising before the sun, they announce and they kind of like lead before and act as like the bodyguards that run in front of the sun. I actually was having some insomnia over the past few nights and was like waking up at 5 a.m. and like sitting there eating a snack. And I looked out at the window and there was this super bright star that was like rising up over the horizon just before sunrise. And I was like, what the hell is that? And it turned out to be Venus. So this little picture for those watching the video version that I shot of Venus rising over the eastern horizon, you can actually see it because it's retrograded and it's getting ready to station direct. You can actually see it as a super bright star a little bit before sunrise. You can also see Mars, but it's a little bit more dim. But these are some shots that I was able to take in my sleepless state. I even went out to the roof and like took some pictures the other night, and you can just see Venus as a super bright star. So that you saying that made me think of that.
Yeah. And that's, and there are in Vedic astrology, there are, I forget the names offhand, but there are several yogas that are just for the sun, that where the qualification is that rising just before or rising just after. And in this case, we've got a ton of both. And so they just seem, I don't have a brilliant read on what exactly that means, but I wanted to bring it up because that's pretty significant.
Yeah. I mean, it was significant in ancient astrology because it seemed like they treated it as serving two functions. One of them is like a protective function for the sun or for the luminaries so that they were literally protected in some way from harm. But another thing it seems like it was used for was an eminence factor when it shows up in birth charts that it indicated the birth of people that were important at the time, just like a king would have people surrounding them like advisors and Secret Service and bodyguards and stuff like that, that a person who was important would also have something like that partially like announce or herald their birth.
Especially if it's like really close to the degree of the heliacal rising, right? When it's actually making that rising from the beams of the sun.
Yeah. And in this case, where it's one sign separation.
Yeah.
But there, what was I going to say? Yeah, I always thought of the preceding the sun and following the moon, or following the sun, in rising and then following and setting combinations as like it's your entourage, or it's the entourage which like opens the door, says guess who's coming, and however many planets all sort of testify to the character of the sun, which is about to arrive. And then with the following, right, you have the train of followers or whatever, which also testifies to a person's importance. And in this case, it's now announcing the sun and Saturn together. Was it 3 planets and Pluto rising ahead, and then Jupiter, Neptune, and for a few days the moon following behind. Like, that's quite the escort.
Yeah, totally. It makes me think one of the hundreds of speculative interpretations about what the birth chart of Jesus would have been if the story of the astrologers in the Gospel of Matthew, the Magi, was valid or true at all. Was Dieter Koch published a book like 10 years ago where he argued that it was a heliacal rising of Venus, and that was what the Star of Bethlehem was, as his speculative sort of interpretation of that. But seeing Venus rise in the eastern horizon right now, you can really see what a spectacular thing it was just visually, and therefore why we associate Venus with beauty and aesthetics and some of the things we associate it with.
Yeah, when Venus is bright, it's the brightest thing in the sky other than the sun. Well, and the moon.
Yeah, so it's the
brightest.
Yeah,
star.
The greatest of the non-luminaries.
So it outshines all other stars in the night sky. So it's literally the most beautiful star, that it stands out, and just you're sort of awestruck by it.
Yeah,
this reminds me of a lot of the conversation you had with Becca Tarnas on Venus. You guys really covered that super well in your planetary series.
Yeah, that was right in the middle of the planetary series. That was a really good episode on Venus. And then I concluded the planetary series, surprisingly, this month with Richard Tarnas in the episode on Pluto, which was a lot of fun. And, I got to mention Alan White's classic line, which has always become one of my main lines about Pluto, that it makes big things small and small things big. And it was funny researching and doing work on the Pluto episode and just seeing how sometimes literally those themes of that were constantly happening in the history of Pluto, even in terms of its discovery and estimations of its size, where it was constantly being overestimated for much of the 20th century about how big it was. And then
even in its classification, its status as a planet
downgraded
itself.
Yeah,
you're right.
It was downgraded. But now recently, after the flyby mission, they found out that it was actually much more geologically interesting than they thought it was. And it may actually contain some of the components for life, which would be wild, which would then, bump it up so that its estimation now might be going back the other direction in terms of becoming more important recently to astronomers.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, and speaking of this, we talked about this at length in the year ahead forecast, but I know, Patrick, you wanted to mention that we have the first exact hit of the Pluto return this month, right?
Right. On February 22nd, that is the day of the exact Pluto return of the Declaration of Independence. I say that specifically, that it's the Pluto return of the Declaration of Independence, because, it's sort of an open question still exactly which chart you should use for the start of the United States. And it's probably more of a ongoing process than something incredible will happen on that day. Of course, we have already highlighted that the changing of the gods is going to be debuting on this day. But
did we say that? I think that was before we started recording.
Oh, that was before we started recording? Okay, well I think that's correct. So apparently the Changing of the Gods documentary is going to be dropped on this on this day. And but I say that it's the Declaration of Independence return rather than the U.S. return, because everything past this point will be the Pluto return of everything that's happened in U.S. history up to this point. So it's probably more helpful, to think of this as, the crucial point within the Pluto return to Capricorn that has been happening since 2008. We've already been in a Pluto return of this sign for many years now. So I'm not exactly expecting some kind of spectacular event or something to manifest on that day, but I do think that this signals, especially as we get into Pluto and Aquarius, that we'll definitely be revisiting fundamentally what the country is about in some respect. And I know that sounds incredibly vague, but I mean, it was during the Pluto and Aquarius period that you saw the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, the establishment of the U.S. presidency. So it's reasonable to assume that these things will be undergoing kind of radical reimaginings, for the 21st century. And this exact Pluto return of the Declaration of Independence, a lot of people do look at that day as the kind of inceptional moment for the United States. It's the signing of the divorce papers. I know I sound English, so you're probably wondering, like, well, what is this guy talking about? It's talking about America. I am an American citizen for whatever it's worth. My mom's American and my father's English. So I just spend July 4th, kind of, I don't know, enjoying myself. I don't really, it doesn't really matter to me. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the Pluto return. One thing I do think that is sort of relevant is that there is kind of an overall pattern with like Pluto going through the cardinal signs and things to do with the monetary system. So, for example, when Pluto was in Cancer, that was the establishment of the Federal Reserve, which is basically the United States central bank. And then Pluto in Libra, that was when the US dollar became uncoupled from the price of gold. And now that when Pluto first entered to Capricorn, this was the 2008 financial crash. And when the central bank, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, had to undergo, take extraordinary measures of quantitative easing, or essentially printing more money in order to cover the cover the liquidity shortages. So we've seen now, since the pandemic has hit, that Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, we've seen that the Federal Reserve again had to take even more extraordinary measures to prop up the financial system. So seeing how kind of shaky things are now, and knowing that the Federal Reserve has kind of used all of its tools already, and it doesn't necessarily have a whole lot more it can do than it's already done to help prop up the financial system. One wonders if the recent shakiness in the market could be, a symptom of a larger problem, which might come about later in this year.
Do we really just wonder that? Sorry.
I guess what I'm saying is I think that it potentially is reflective of, the diminishing value of the dollar, potentially with bad consequences, especially with how inflation has affected the price of the dollar. And the recent events in recent years have caused the US dollar to be kind of reevaluated as a global reserve currency. So, I guess the most extreme version of what I'm saying is that you could say this signals the the beginning of the end, of the hegemony of the US dollar, and that there would need to be like a new replacement currency, say, for example, a Fed coin, or switching to a kind of other currency like Bitcoin or something to sort of replace the Federal Reserve's control over the US dollar.
Just one thing I'd like to add to that, your research about Pluto in cardinal signs corresponding to important financial changes for the U.S. It's in that declaration chart, Pluto's in the second natally.
In the Sibley chart.
Sibley chart, that's correct.
Yeah, the U.S. has according to that chart, an inherently Plutonian relationship to money, which I think is easy to validate.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'm just pulling up the Sibley chart here, where we have 12 degrees of Sag rising and Pluto at 2732 Capricorn. So that is the point that it's taken this long for Pluto to go around the entire zodiac and come back to where it started. And yeah, the question of whether some of that could be financially related. I mean, of course, people have to go back to the last episode, the year ahead forecast, for our full Pluto discussion, since we spent a lot of time on this. I talked about how, because it was tied in with the Declaration of Independence, it was also tied in with some of the things having to do with just America as a democracy and the experiment of America as a democracy, which I think is one of the challenges that is coming up during this time, where both sides politically are saying that the democratic process has been undermined in some way. So clearly that's a major thing that's happening right now, and will be one of the major questions this year, is the extent to which that's going to be either fixed or, crumble even worse for some reason. One of the things I meant to mention in the last episode, the year ahead forecast, that I didn't, one of the charts that I noticed was getting hit by this. And I know Demetra George mentioned to me she was interested in how it was getting hit, but also I think Lisa mentioned it to me, was Kamala Harris's chart, just because she was born at an exact full moon, with her moon at 27 degrees of Aries and her sun at 27 degrees of Libra. And so that Pluto return of the United States at 27 Capricorn is squaring both of her luminaries, which is a pretty challenging transit for somebody to have, just in terms of Pluto having to do with issues of control and manipulation and other tendencies that can be really tough, dealing with underworldly things and other things like that. So, I'm paying attention to her chart this year and how that goes. She's not having a super great time recently and has been getting some bad press over the course of the past month or two, especially. But sometimes one of the things that Pluto can do is it can diminish a person's power, and there can be sometimes downfalls, but also sometimes due to difficult or tragic events, sometimes there can be major increases in power at the same time. So that's one of the things that I want to pay attention to as well.
Yeah, that's a really, should we say, important and weird thread with big Pluto transits, is I see people being crazy empowered, and then also having all of their power taken away. Pluto has a real penchant for extremes, right? Though, the huge and the tiny, the all-powerful and the utterly powerless.
Yeah, it doesn't do in-betweens.
Yeah, well, it seems to try to sort out from the middles, right? It's let's take that and blow it up, and let's take that and shrink it. And it's something I've thought a lot about, because, when you're looking for yourself or a client or whoever, you're looking at a big upcoming Pluto transit and trying to figure out what it's going to do. Because I find it more difficult to predict exactly what kind of Plutonian action they'll get from a transit than any other planet, probably.
Yeah.
It's I can tell you the 4 things Pluto does. It's definitely going to do one of these, right? And maybe all 4, but it's difficult, I think, to sort ahead of time.
Yeah, because one of the things is it really intensifies whatever planets it's touching, if it's touching other planets, and just empowers them to take their energy to the utmost extreme. But also one of the things I really got from the Changing of the Gods documentary. I'm not really plugging it. I am interviewing the director next week, so I've been watching this series, and there was 2 episodes in particular, episodes 4 and 5, because it's a 10-part. It went from a single documentary movie to a 10-part series over the past 5 to 6 years they've been working on it. But one of the things I really got from those 2 episodes were power disparities, and how Pluto really has to do with power disparities when they exist, and that sometimes when power disparities do exist, the tendency for them to be abused in different ways as like a major theme. And if you follow that as like a core meaning, then you see it showing up in all sorts of different situations where there's power disparities in society. For example, in terms of sex and sexuality, or just gender issues, like the women's rights and some of the things that happened in terms of that in the 1960s, as well as further back under the Pluto-Uranus alignments, but also civil rights and like what happens when there's like groups that are being oppressed in society due to power disparities, and the struggle to realign or readjust to those power disparities in different ways, I thought was really interesting as a theme.
Yeah, that Pluto's power to like negate people is really a huge theme, right? To negate the humanity of, you know, X or Y group, and also to one another thing I see about trine is sometimes it'll negate a planet that it touches, like it's like that part of the person's like psyche or life just turns off for a while. You know, and that's where some of the the in the underworld, right, like disappeared from the sunlight realm and then reappearing later. You know, and that's for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it's like a depression or a transformation, but there's like a negation and a disappearance followed by a later changed reemergence.
Totally. But yeah, dark night of the soul can be a major thing in Pluto transits. So that'll be really interesting to see, both in terms of the country going through a dark night of the soul period for a little bit here, and individuals that have, you know, personal planets around 27 degrees getting hit by that as well, such as the chart we were just talking about. So this just made me remember like two major things that we meant to mention that we are about to skip and not. Both of them were actually ones that we have to harken back to from the year ahead forecast we recorded in early to mid-December that went really well in terms of some of our statements. Like one of them was mine personally, which is I was wondering idly last month as Jupiter was finishing up in Aquarius, it had been so good for Bitcoin when Jupiter was in Aquarius starting in like December of 2020. And then it dipped, and there was this interesting dip in Bitcoin over last summer when Jupiter went into Pisces briefly. And so my curiosity that I stated, I think in the year ahead forecast in one of the other episodes, maybe the one I did with Adam Summer early last month, was when Jupiter goes back into Pisces in December, as it did a few weeks ago, is the price of Bitcoin going to tank again like it did when it dipped in over the summer? And it turns out that the answer is yes. So the price of Bitcoin has been like dropping pretty steadily since hitting, I guess, a high in November. And then Jupiter went into Pisces and it's just been dropping. So I am not a financial astrologer or a big Bitcoin guy, but I've just been dipping my toe into paying attention to stuff like that over the past year or so. And it's just fascinating to sometimes see some of these planetary cycles and be able to put them up against, you know, objective like graphs and things to like see the trends and have some sort of objective way to look at the astrology that's not just, you know, the more subjective, like internal, like how am I feeling or what's going on in my life at different times like that.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting about that Jupiter ingress into Pisces in May of 2021 was the fact that a lot of people who follow Bitcoin astrologically were expecting there to be a really big increase in its price because they figured, oh, Jupiter is like a benefic. It's about wealth. It's going into its own sign. The Venus position in the natal chart that most people use for Bitcoin is at like 0 degrees or 1 degree of Pisces. So people were seeing, okay, we have a very good looking Jupiter making a conjunction to a very, you know, to an exalted Venus in the Bitcoin chart. This should be great. And it entered and it went down. It was almost the exact opposite of what people expected. And the only person who correctly identified that it would go down was, I don't know if he necessarily wants me to mention it, but Dr. H of Regulus Astrology. He had indicated to me in conversations that he has witnessed in past cycles that Jupiter is in Pisces tends to be really bad for markets in general. And the reason is because Pisces is the fallen sign of Mercury, and Mercury is the planet most relevant for trading, and the accumulation or clever concentration of wealth, whereas Jupiter is about expenditures and giving things away or spreading wealth out as opposed to consolidating it. And so markets only go up when wealth is being kept, but not when it's being distributed. So I thought that was a very interesting and sort of theoretically consistent or coherent sort of rationale for why Jupiter and Pisces would actually be bad for markets. And it seems to be borne out by what's been happening with the general market as well as with Bitcoin. I know that a lot of people also remarked that at the exact time of the last solar eclipse in Sagittarius, that also seemed to signal a very precipitous decline in the value of crypto. So there seem to be some very strange things going on. I've only dipped my toes into financial astrology for the past couple of years or so, and there's definitely some interesting ways in which you have to kind of reconceptualize the way you typically understand things in a natal context. But there definitely seem to be some really curious correlations that suggest that this is something that could be understood and could be, forecast more precisely.
Yeah. All right. Any thoughts on that before we move on, Austin?
I think those are some really interesting thoughts about Jupiter and Pisces. I would say I would disagree that Jupiter is only about spreading out wealth. It's also I would argue the long-term accumulation of wealth and things that have value. And I think every text ever supports that, but that is not necessarily it. Financially, that's almost like looking at the savings rate, which is not good for markets at all. Markets do well when people are trading constantly. As Kate points out in the comments, Jupiter being exalted in Cancer shows that its thing that it's very best at is gathering everything and keeping it. That accumulative power of the moon with Jupiter is really good. And it's not that Jupiter won't splash out, but I see Jupiter in terms of like literally 12-year cycle wealth planning, whereas Mercury is like, is this a good deal right now? And the more of those interactions you have, the more a market goes up.
Of course, the other way to look at that really positive Jupiter conjunction to the Venus of the natal Bitcoin chart is that, that is when people sold. That's when people were able to cash out their earnings. I'm not so sure that you can.
Right, like I want to stop trading now.
I'm going to take my earnings. I mean, yeah, a lot of people made a lot of money as they sold, right? So it made the line go down. It's tricky because basically we have like many, many variables that only show up as a line going up, down, or staying constant. So it's hard to identify. It's hard to always perfectly link what astrological variable is in play for what direction that line goes in. There are different reasons the line can go up or down. So it's tricky, but I think with maybe with artificial intelligence, we'll be able to kind of crack what's sort of corresponding to what.
We've also got a lot of Jupiter and Pisces left. We'll see whether that's the case with Bitcoin or not.
Yes, definitely, for sure. Interesting bit of Jupiter and Aquarius / Pisces news that I noticed at the end of December was that there was a huge spike in sales of virtual reality headsets over the holidays. And after everybody received them as gifts for Christmas, basically, suddenly VR apps like the Oculus app started trending and hit the #1 downloaded app in Apple's App Store, which I thought was a really wild thing, seeing the changeover at the end of December from from Aquarius going into Pisces, where we're, of course, going to get that Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in April. And not to go on another 30-minute tangent about Avatar that we talked about for a very long time in the last episode, but I know, Patrick, you pointed out something very interesting to me about Avatar and its sequel that you mentioned to me that I thought was interesting.
Basically just has to do with the elements of that Jupiter and Neptune are conjunct in. So back in 2009, at the release of the first Avatar movie, Jupiter was conjunct Neptune in Aquarius. And Aquarius is an air sign. And so when you watch the first Avatar movie, you'll notice that there are many stunning scenes of flight, where you see the main characters flying through the air on these kind of raptor alien things. And there are also scenes of flight through these places where the mountains are floating, that were kind of based on the floating Chinese mountains in China. And so there's a lot of imagery in the movie that circulates around this notion of flying through the air, and of course, Aquarius is an air sign. So this is really interesting because, Jupiter is conjunct Neptune in Pisces, a water sign, with the release of Avatar 2. The rumored subtitle for Avatar 2 is The Way of Water. And the film is set underwater, basically. The actors actually had to learn how to hold their breath underwater for minutes at a time in order to do all of the filming needed for this film. So it's all set underwater and all themed around water and oceans. And so it's very appropriate that the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction is happening in Pisces. It's also worth noting that, Jupiter-Neptune conjunctions in general have this long connection to cinema, and the Jupiter-Neptune prior to Avatar coming out was in Capricorn, and that was basically right before Titanic came out, which was James Cameron's other, huge blockbuster movie. And if you think of the sign of Capricorn, it's a sea goat. It's based on that Babylonian or Sumerian god Enki, who is sort of lord of the earth and the sea. And there's a few myths surrounding Enki that have to do with boats being attacked by the waters below, which is kind of interesting that, the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction happens at Capricorn, and the big cinematic spectacle of that time is, a boat that sinks. There might be a lot more there.
But good point. Very interesting sometimes how literal things are in terms of the two Avatar things, and we'll see what happens with the sequel when it's released in December later this year. But we mention it because this is relevant, because Jupiter is just inching closer and closer and is rapidly approaching that exact conjunction with Pisces as we go through February, and then it'll go exact in early April. So it's good to be aware of some of the archetypes going on right now and to start paying attention to how it starts manifesting in the world around us in between now and then.
I would also say, just a very short note too, that you might also want to keep track of what's happening in the MCU at that time, because under that same Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Aquarius, that was when Disney bought Marvel, and the different Marvel phases that they've, how Marvel planned out its slate of movies in phases, they all occur at Jupiter-Neptune hard aspects. So phase 1, and in 2012, the first Jupiter-Neptune square, Captain America Civil War, beginning of phase or end of phase 2, that was the Jupiter-Neptune opposition in 2016. And then Avengers Endgame came out of the Jupiter-Neptune closing square in 2019. And now we're back at the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, which will be occurring in March or April to 2022. So I am assuming that we'll hear some sort of news about a new acquisition by Disney or something cool happening with the Marvel shows, or the MCU will be kind of the next big step for these franchises. So it'll be like the final hurrah too, because this is the final Jupiter-Neptune conjunction we have before, the depressing 2025 Saturn-Neptune conjunction comes in to kind of end the party for this whole mode of entertainment.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's good research.
All right. So Tuesday, February 8th, I'm bringing things back locally to the astrology of February. We got a Mars-Uranus trine, which, like that Mars-Jupiter sextile, seems productive, innovative, getting some stuff done, finding new ways to do it. Any other quick keywords, Austin?
Yeah, making those changes that you need to make, right? Uranus is sometimes just, I know I need to make some changes in that area of my life, and that Mars trine is a great time to make those changes.
Yeah. Quick keywords, Patrick, Mars trine Uranus?
I guess spontaneous action, sort of taking the opportunity to get things done if you didn't plan on getting them done, just being prepared to kind of having to spring into action. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a bad kind of thing, given that it's a trine, but yeah, those are some of the ideas that pop into mind.
That's good. All right. Then we got the Mercury Pluto on Friday the 11th, which we've talked about extensively. moving into the following week, we have the Mercury ingress into Aquarius on Valentine's Day that we talked about. And this is a very interesting Valentine's Day because the Mars Venus conjunction is super close by that point. It doesn't perfect until Wednesday the 16th, which is also the day of the full moon in Leo, which is interesting, and that's what I want to pull up next. But even once we get to Valentine's Day on the 14th, Mars and Venus, I think they're within a degree, and I think they're in the same degree, which is like 16 or something. So that is a very passionate looking aspect or configuration for Valentine's Day. Let me pull that up so we can look at actual chart placements for that day.
There Memes about being horny on Maine. That's the meme prediction for the moon.
That's the meme? Okay.
Well, because it's happening at the same time as a Venus-Mars conjunction. I mean, it's not exactly configured with it, but, you could. I mean, in general, this is a really interesting full moon as well because it's square the nodes, and that means it's square the nodes on the northern bending, right? So this is a full moon when it's at its brightest phase and at its northernmost latitude of the sun. So it's brightest and highest above the sun. So that would tell us that this is like the sentiment is high and emotional reactivity is sort of at a kind of height. And kind of taking a little bit back to some of the Russia discussion, I'm kind of a little concerned about this particular full moon for this topic because it just seems like this is a time when people would be kind of riled up to act or to react badly, or we just know that this moon at this sort of heightened kind of state would reflect people maybe making sort of rash decisions or being at a kind of height of impetus to do something.
Yeah, a culmination of events. And this is also the day that Mars overtakes Venus. And as I've been thinking about that interchange between Mars and Venus more, one of the simplest, and I can't believe I don't bring it up more often, it's not as often in world events that you get an occasion to bring it up, but one of the primary interplays between Mars and Venus has always been themes of war and peace. Most simply, at its most simple, Venus and Mars and war and peace, and seeing the interchange of those two this month. And at first, Mars in the middle of the month getting the upper hand over Venus and the potential impulse for war, perhaps, being the one that wins out, versus by early in the following month, by later February and early March, the Venus impulse sort of overcoming Mars, and perhaps the peace impulse or the peacekeeping impulse calming things down, hopefully.
So maybe only in that in-between period between those two conjunctions would there actually be sort of more of a potential for sort of armed conflicts happening.
I hope so. I mean, I'm not, again, like with the Bitcoin stuff, I'm not a war expert on like military astrology, like Theophilus of Edessa or something from the 8th century, but it's interesting seeing some of these themes play out in real time. And that's what we're always constantly doing. That's part of the purpose of these deep dive forecast episodes over the past 6-7 years now, is watching world events, documenting what's happening at the time, learning things from the symbolism as we see it happen, just like our, Mesopotamian ancestors did 2,000-3,000 years ago in astrology, of like seeing a correlation in the sky and writing down on little clay tablets what happened and if the king died or whatever. So, and trying to call things ahead of time. That was we're already moving on, and I forgot there was one last thing we needed to mention. We needed to do a bit of a victory lap about Austin, which is we were nervous. And if you go back and watch the year ahead forecast for 2021, the month we were the most nervous about because of the combinations that month was November, and specifically that Mars-Saturn square that was happening in between Mars going through Scorpio and squaring Saturn. And we caught this on one of our final couple of episodes of the December forecast, and then especially the year ahead forecast we mentioned again in passing, but we had seen that there was a new variant that had just been identified in mid-November around the time of that Mars-Saturn square, and that turned out to be the Omicron variant, which suddenly just exploded, and the numbers of COVID around the world just skyrocketed over the course of the past few weeks. Potentially higher than at any other time in the pandemic, because it turned out to be a highly transmissible form of COVID. And there were just, on the Twitter timeline, I was just seeing like astrologers left and right getting sick with COVID who had dodged it for the entire pandemic. And it's been a pretty wild month and a half since our last episode. So that's actually something I can't believe we forgot to mention up to this point, because it's really, dominated the news and the headlines in many people's lives very recently.
Yeah. November's had a number of almost hilariously terrible things. And which I think we talked about this a little bit, maybe on the yearly or for December, but there's also that like gnarly configurations will often create a bad at the time, but they will also set things in motion that won't become clear until they run a bit of that track, like the Omicron variant being one of those. So yeah, I'll take that win with you.
Good job, guys.
Yeah, I mean, just people can go back and look at that in terms of our trepidation. But yeah, that's one of those tricky principles when it comes to electional charts and stuff, is just you're creating a foundation for something. And sometimes if it's a day of event, you're trying to get it to go well in terms of the event that day. Like, let's say it's a marriage or something and the ceremony going well. But what you're doing when you pick a birth chart for something at the time is you're laying the seeds for how that thing is going to grow and develop in the future. And in some of these instances with these things, we're talking about the seeds of something being laid at the time that will become major in the future. But it's like a growth process by looking at the origins of it. So yeah, that has been tricky. And I guess the numbers are starting to go down in the UK, and now I think it's starting to take a turn here in the US, with the numbers starting to drop, but we're still very close to the peak of it, but hopefully that will continue to drop. That does, however, now make me nervous about the upcoming Mars-Saturn conjunction, which is going to take place in Aquarius, because that was kind of what we started this entire 2-year cycle with, back in 2020, was first the Mars-Saturn co-presence in Capricorn, and all of the lockdowns starting to take place all across the West, at least. But then right in the middle of the early part of the lockdowns was that Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. And I know that was when I got sick with COVID and was sick for like a month, and a lot of people were sick or dealing with the lockdowns or what have you. And so in some ways, we're going to be seeing a closing down of that 2-year cycle, and hopefully, putting some end to it in terms of just this nightmare of the past 2 years of dealing with COVID and all the changes and annoyances and other things it's made in the world around us. But then also the start of the foundation of a new cycle of whatever the next 2.5 years is going to look like. And we have seen now in the very past 2 Mars-Saturn alignments, 2 variants happen. So one of them was last summer when the Delta variant happened around the time of the Mars-Saturn opposition and then got really big. And then most recently, we had the Omicron variant begin around the time of the Mars-Saturn square. So that makes me a little bit nervous, because we're going to be having the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction at the same time in early April. So it's one of those times again where it's like, everything's good again. But then there's something ending and something starting at that time that could end up being difficult in the long term.
Yeah, it's funny. We haven't talked about it, but I've been literally thinking pretty much the same thing in terms of, so this is the closing out of a cycle and the beginning of a new cycle. Does the next one look like the last one? And I don't think I have a great answer yet. But that, it's for, the Mars-Saturn conjunctions are like a new moon for horror, right? Cycle. It's the new moon for the cycle of doom that's going at the same time as happier cycles, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I saw a tweet where somebody in passing was just like, COVID has become what we all feared that Ebola was going to be back in like 2013. And what's funny about that is like one of the major Ebola outbreaks back then was at a Mars-Saturn conjunction in Scorpio.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, but that's a good question, Austin. Are the, ingredients the same compared to where they were 2 years ago? I mean, one of the major differences is now Saturn is 20 degrees off of Pluto, and they're in separate signs. So we're outside of even like, the 15 degree range, for example, that Richard Tarnas uses for outer planet conjunctions. And I don't think it's going to come back within that 15 degree range. So maybe that's one sort of positive thing that we can say in terms of the start of this new Mars-Saturn cycle is at least, it's not going to be tied in with the conjunction with Saturn and Pluto like the last one was, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it would only continue along the same vein for as long as Saturn's in Aquarius, since that seems to be what's promoting the idea of bad airs,
Right, but Saturn's going to
something
be
bad in the air.
I mean, it's if it seeds it while Saturn's in Aquarius, that's another 2.5 years of bad
This will be a
luck.
great case study, I guess. See in real time, is this the closure, or is this just, another block of it?
Yeah, there's something that looks very optimistic during that time in early April, because we're probably coming down off of this current wave and we're probably clear of it by then, I assume, of the Omicron variant, and have it under control. And so we have this very optimistic looking Jupiter-Saturn conjunction going exact, or Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. But with that Neptune, it's just like there's something distracting about it, or something illusory about it.
It's Pleasure Island.
Or, it's really like Patrick was saying, yeah, it's movies you really enjoy. That doesn't necessarily help with, other problems.
Stay home and watch Disney Plus, don't, but otherwise, be wary.
Yeah, so we'll have to pay attention to it just because it's starting something new with that Saturn-Pluto cycle at the same time. And I don't know, I hope it's not another stupid third variant or something like that, but yeah, we'll see.
Getting pretty tiresome.
Yeah.
That's also March or April. We're on February, right?
Yeah. So over it. Okay.
So February, what happens in February?
Back to February. So Patrick, you mentioned the nodes, and I think that's really important because the nodes change signs since we did the last episode in mid-January, and a lot of people talked about that. There was a little bit of a true node versus mean node discussion, but for me, the difference between the true node and the mean node has always been pretty clear. I mean, we have the true node, as we can see here in this diagram, versus the mean node, which has a very distinctive sort of appearance in terms of its furrowed brow and deep piercing eyes. With the mean node, it's just, he's kind of grumpy. And I think that's
one might say mean.
Right. I mean, that's the ancient translation, I think, of the Greek or the Persian term, but what do you guys use? Do you use true node or mean node? I'm a true node person, but I don't have a strong feeling, but it usually seems to line up better with true node personally.
I'm a mean node person, but I'm equally non-emphatic. For me, I used mean because the Vedic tradition I've learned in uses mean. They're super good at nodes, so I'm just gonna cede to the authority there. But I would not be upset or care in any way if someone used the true node instead.
Right. Neither of us is going to strap a bomb to our chest in order to make this case.
Yeah, not going to go full truther about that.
Okay.
I've always used true node, but I have become warmer to the mean node because it matches the way that we calculate the longitude of other planets, because the true node is taking into account the barycenter, the center of gravity between the Earth and the moon. So whereas the mean node is just assuming that the moon travels around the exact center of the Earth, and that's the way that we calculate the positions of the other planets. Now, if you were to take into account the barycenter, of the other planets, then it probably wouldn't change it by any much, by any great amount. And even with the moon, you can see the differences, basically negligible. It's between, 0 to 2 degrees. So it usually doesn't make much of a difference most of the time, mostly just around the sign boundaries, or if you're investigating the exact degree rulerships of the North Node and South Node. But so I've become warmer to the conceptual basis of the mean node as being more legitimate. But I've always used true node, and I similarly hold a very non-committal, easygoing stance about it. I don't feel very extremely about it either way.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that just because this lunation, this full moon at 28 Leo, is so closely square the nodes that means we're at the halfway point between one set of eclipses and before the next set of eclipses. And it means we're headed headlong into 3 months later, the next set of fully fixed sign eclipses, where we're going to get our second eclipse in Taurus of the series, and we're going to get our first eclipse in Scorpio. So there's really this emphasis that's moving towards, and is going to push us towards in February, towards the fixed signs and the activation of the fixed sign axis in basically everybody's chart. And that's only going to be accelerated, as we get Mercury going back into Aquarius. We get Saturn is now treading new ground between, 13 Aquarius to about 24, 25 Aquarius, that it hasn't gotten to before in terms of the fixed signs. And this Leo eclipse is really important turning point in terms of that, in terms of continuing to heighten the focus on the fixed signs in different charts.
Yep.
Yeah, always important to remember which end of the nodes you're talking about. Remember, this is the northernmost point of the moon's path. So it's where the moon. This is a full moon that is highest above the eclipse, highest above the sun, most north of the sun. Way. Yeah.
Yeah. So otherwise, it's like this is not configured very closely to anything. I think the closest aspect is just the opposition with Saturn that's moving away about 10 degrees apart in terms of that full moon, of both luminaries moving off of the either conjunction or opposition with Saturn, and then the simultaneous conjunction of Mars and Venus that's happening that day, and perhaps the Mars impulse of acting, sort of getting the upper hand and moving forward or doing something decisive happening at that time when things sort of come to a culmination and you feel like an action needs to take place. And for some people that might be a constructive action and that may be necessary. And for others, they may find they've acted too impulsively or do something that they regret, that they later have to revisit later in the month or early in the following month when Venus again conjoins Mars. So that is the full moon. Let's move into the final phase of this. There's a little outer planet alignment that occurs the very next day, which is Jupiter sextiling Uranus, which is, again, a pretty nice little productive, constructive, growth-oriented and innovation type aspect. It's not a huge major thing to write home about, but nonetheless still seems a little nice feature of February.
Yeah, it's just like a little help either making useful Uranian changes or a little help managing Uranian chaos.
Right.
I would think if we see Uranus and Taurus as generally representing volatility in financial markets, we might see Jupiter sextiling Uranus as being a time of greater stability.
Yeah, like just
potentially.
A little, not fixing it, but just like little hands on the wheel.
Right. Yeah. Little reassurance.
Yeah. My keyword for that on Thursday, the 17th, is an unexpected opportunity. So that is Thursday the 17th. Then the sun moves into Pisces, and all of our Pisces friends rejoice on Friday the 18th. We could have the beginning of Pisces season, and some of our friends start having birthdays not long after that. I don't want to name any names, but I might be getting them a pendant or something for their birthday. We'll see.
Or a mug.
They might be auspicious.
Yeah,
people.
Auspicious. AA.
My solar return this year, by the way, is truly auspicious. We will talk about it next month because it's in March.
Okay.
It's nice. I haven't had a good one in years.
Yeah, that's always a good feeling to like look ahead and not like groan when you look at your solar return chart.
Yeah.
All right. So moving into Wednesday, or moving the final week, we've got Wednesday, the 23rd of February. There's
just one thing. So, and the sun moving into Pisces is a huge change because we're going from the sun hanging out in a Saturn ruled sign with Saturn to the sun hanging out in a Jupiter ruled sign with Jupiter right there.
Yes.
Like that's much more positive, much more. Maybe everything is okay. Maybe it's even
Mardi
maybe
Gras
it's even
will be
great.
popping.
Maybe it's okay to go outside again.
Yeah, it's they're just very big tone change.
Yeah, lightening the mood. I think that's a good keyword for our February 18th ingress of the sun into Pisces, is getting out of the more restrictive, somewhat pessimistic side of the Sun-Saturn conjunction that we've been having for most of the previous month, and moving into the more optimistic, growth-oriented Sun-Jupiter conjunction that then builds up over the course of the next 10 to 11 days.
I like buoyant for
buoyant.
Jupiter, especially Jupiter in Pisces.
That's a good one.
I predict people will be especially bad at Lent this year. They'll be bad at maintaining their promises or their sacrifices, right? Because the Sun is conjoining Jupiter and Neptune. It just looks far more indulgent than you might otherwise expect. And it's always Lent, while the Sun's in Pisces.
Jupiter is good for religious, for faith and spirituality, though. Maybe Lent will be super meaningful to more people, and they'll also do a worse job at it.
But it's also it's also that kind of bacchanalian type of quality there too, especially with Neptune in the mix. It just looks like the gravitation towards the things that will sort of ease the pain or suffering, or ease the longing for what you want.
Fentanyl in the Eucharist.
Just, oh Lord. Alcohol. Sorry. Real alcohol in the wine. I don't know. I don't know how many Catholics watch this. I doubt many, but as a former Catholic, I sort of noticed these things.
I honestly mean no disrespect. I was just making jokes.
Speaking of alcohol in the wine, we have a Mars-Neptune sextile, which goes exact on the 23rd, followed very quickly by a pleasant little Venus-Neptune sextile, which goes exact the next day on February 24th. So again, these are like somewhat minor aspects. The sextile is always traditionally treated as a weak aspect. It's not like a hard aspect that like does things, but there can still be a moderately sort of positive vibe of things being relatively okay during that time when you have certain transits like that. What are some of our keywords for Mars sextile Neptune or Venus sextile Neptune?
Well, I like Neptune's ability I like Neptune's ability to just mellow things a bit by sextile, right? The mellowing can become like a full on dissolution if you have too much Neptune energy, but just by sextile, just kind of mellows out that Mars Venus, which at this point we're probably getting a little tired of its passionate intensity.
Yeah, it's been pretty passionate all the way up until this point in the month, and it could be nice to have a little bit of like Neptune and chill by February 23rd, 24th to take the edge off of things.
Looks like a good day to play like a big video game or something, something with a lot of just mindless like fighting bad guys, with Mars sextile Neptune. This what I'd imagine is like, I don't know, like putting God of War on or something.
Yeah, it's like by sextile, instead of, the full-on opiate or psychedelic level of Neptune, it's like Neptune cracks in half an anti-anxiety pill for Mars and Venus to split.
There you go.
To take the edge off.
I was going to say the single glass of wine or the, couple puffs of reefer to take the edge off of the Mars-Venus interaction and the intensity of the dynamic and the pull between those two in wanting to take things in two different directions. Yeah, so that honestly is our last major aspect of the month. What's weird is like we're building up to this interesting little, what I've been calling like the conjunctional climax of 2022, but it doesn't go exact until the very beginning of next month. But you can see it forming here with the Sun approaching that conjunction with Jupiter in Pisces, Mercury approaching a conjunction with Saturn in Aquarius, and then the second Venus-Mars conjunction, but there's a triple conjunction that happens at like 27 Capricorn with Venus, Mars, and Pluto. So it's this very interesting configuration that we saw when we were picking out electional charts for the year ahead, just because all three of those triple sets of conjunctions go exact very close to each other around the time of the new moon in Pisces next month, around March 2nd. So that's going to feature heavily in our next forecast. We don't have to dwell on it too much, but it's something to mention just because we're heading into it very rapidly by the time we get to the end of February.
Extreme desires, extreme passions.
One thing I would add is that starting with the sun's ingress into Pisces, we enter about a 2-week period of relative chill because I believe it's March 6th, both Mars and Venus enter both Mars and Venus enter Aquarius. And then we have Mars-Saturn co-presence again with Venus. And that's really difficult on Venus, and Mars-Saturn is just rough in general. But
puts the brakes on things.
Sorry?
It slams the brakes on.
Yeah, it definitely, there's some mellow that it harshes. And so it's not that, all is perfect from, let's say, the February 19th to March 5th. But it's like, as far as this year has gone so far, it's a period of relative chill.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good point. So there's a definite momentum shift that happens by early March. But we're heading into that here and seeing that Pisces ingress of the sun on the 18th and 19th. That's sort of when we start heading in that direction, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then, the Pluto return happens on the 22nd. We've already talked about that at length. And that kind of brings us to the end of the month, guys.
I think it does. All right.
We made it.
Brilliant. Well, that is the astrology of February. Cool. What do you two have coming up this month, or what are you up to in February?
Okay. Well, I will finally have my enrollment will be open for my self-paced year 1 astrology class that opens at a rising sign of my choosing on February 17th. I know that's the day. I gotta figure out which of a rising I want. But I've been working on that for a while. I'm really excited. That's about to go. It's self-paced, and I'll be doing some live session support, and I also have several members of several graduates of my 3-year program who will also be helping out. So you'll get to talk to people about the material that aren't just me, because you're going to be listening to a lot of videos with just me talking. So I'm excited about that. And then other than that, back to work on faces, and Sphere and Sundry has a big Venus launch coming up, unspecified, but early Feb. It's right around the corner. It's a super good election from Venus and Libra last year. I'm very excited about it. I've been using it. It smells good. It feels good.
Nice. That's exciting.
It also looks good.
Yeah, some of the promo photos are just incredible every time. I recommend people sign up for the Sphere and Sundry Instagram feed, because that always seems like the best way to see some of the behind the scenes working and the beautiful images of just the stuff that's being crafted.
I just want to take 1 second to say, Kate is has no training whatsoever in photography. She just started doing pictures one day, and it's extraordinary. She has lots of talents that she's worked hard to develop, but I think it was really around the beginning of Sphere and Sundry. It was like, wow, you make everything look so good. It was a fun discovery. Anyway, so love you, baby.
It is as if Libras have an innate aesthetic sense or something.
Yeah, this one does.
This one, not all of them, you're saying. Just beautiful.
It's nice.
I love seeing that stuff. All right. Patrick, what do you got going on?
Well, my schedule is full of clients. Very grateful to be that busy, but I also it's also a little tricky right now because I'm in the middle of packing up and moving, and so that's why I have some sexy gray drapes hanging behind me instead of my bookshelf. And I also selected February 17th as the day that I'm actually listing my house with a rising sign yet to be determined, because there's a few I can't figure out which one is. I have to take one. I have to take a drawback. There's better. I mean, there's like a few good ones, but like,
don't give away the good rising signs.
But I risk having like the Malefic in the 8th, or like the Ruler of the 2nd not potentially being as good. So I've been trying to figure out which one would be worse for me as the seller. But In any case, so I'm busy with that, but astrology-wise, I am still really focused on getting the rectification course completed that I've been working on with Chris, and I think eventually at some point I'll probably end up just flying out there and doing it in person with you, because it's just a little too chaotic right now when I'll be in between houses. But that is definitely number one priority. Aside from the clients who've already scheduled with me. So, I've just been hitting it hard with general consultations, rectifications, elections, horary, and tutoring services that I offer. And I'm at some point going to get back into doing more regular blogs and videos. But I'm a long way away from it right now.
Brilliant. All right. So your website is patrickwatsonAstrologer.com.
PatrickWatsonAstrology.com.
Astrology.com. Okay. If you go to the other one, does it go to like some shadow Patrick Watson?
Someone took my domain and...
Oh my God. There's like an evil Patrick Watson astrologer.
And then there's the even worse one, which is PatrickWatsonAstrologist.com.
Oh God. We don't talk about that guy.
Yeah. So it's PatrickWatsonAstrology.com.
Okay, good. Got it. Austin, your website is austincoppock.com and sphereandsundry.com. Want to make sure those get mentioned. As for me, I'm going to mainly be focusing on the podcast. I'm interviewing the director of the Changing of the Gods astrology documentary next week, and I'll release that as an episode sometime in February. And I've got other episodes I'm lining up. A major episode on transits I've got in the works, a major episode on, actually, funny enough, the astrology versus astrologist debate. And I'm also getting ready to launch a new series on a deep dive on each of the signs of the zodiac. Now that I've finished my series on each of the planets, it's time to look at the signs of the zodiac and talk about those with one episode with a prominent astrologer on each of the 12 signs. So if people are interested in that work, if you want to get early access to that work, if you'd like to get access to private podcasts that I don't release to the public, then all you have to do is become a patron through my page on patreon.com/the Astrology Podcast. And there's a bunch of different tiers, including early access, attend live recordings, get access to the Auspicious Elections episode, or even get a producer credit at the end of one of these episodes of the show. So if you enjoy this content and you want to support the work we're doing here, or want to help me to expand it so I can do more stuff or fly out people like Patrick, or eventually once Omicron goes away, people like Austin to do these episodes in person, then think about becoming a patron of the Astrology Podcast. All right, that's it for this forecast, and that's it for this look at the astrology of February. Thanks, guys, for doing this. This is a lot of fun. It takes me back to the mid-2000s and hanging out with the two of you when we were much younger, little astrologers at Project Hindsight. And Patrick, it's awesome to have you on the show in this capacity. This was great.
Oh, thank you so much. It is a total honor. I'm so happy that you invited me to be on. I can't lie. I was very, very excited.
Awesome. And, it didn't even occur to me, but Venus retro, it's totally like friend from the past.
Right.
Like how many people have we had on that we've both known for like 16 years?
Yeah, I love that. That's perfect.
Yeah, true. And Austin, you did send me those risque DMs beforehand as well. So there was that as well.
I don't know if you were supposed to mention that, Patrick. That's part of the disclosure.
You mean all of the
kidding, of course.
The Firmicus jokes?
Right. The Firmicus Maternus. He was a risky fellow, that 4th century astrologer.
Well, he was a firm guy.
All right. We'll leave you with that thought as your Valentine's Day parting episode thought for February. All right, guys. That's all I got. I don't have a better ending than that. So thanks everyone for watching this episode of the Astrology Podcast. Please be sure to drop a comment or like the video on YouTube if you like this episode. And we'll see you again next month for the Astrology of March. So good luck and take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Coppock, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly Auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrology podcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at hellenisticastrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for both iPhone and Android at astrogold.io. There are also two major astrology conferences happening this year. The first is the Northwest Astrological Conference, happening May 26th through the 30th, 2022, near Seattle, Washington. Find out more information at norwac.net. And the second is the International Society for Astrological Research Conference, which is taking place August 25th through the 29th, 2022, in Westminster, Colorado. And you can find out more information about that at isar2022.org.